Good morning. Thank you for being part of this virtual presentation of the Manlius Informed series. We wrap up our fall 2021 series by hosting our annual visit from WCNY's Ivory Tower panel, which will be moderated by David Chanatry, professor of journalism at Utica College and director of the New York Reporting Project. David has also recently co-produced a new documentary film titled Utica, The Last Refuge, which premieres this Saturday at the Stanley Theater in Utica at 7 p.m. Joining us today are Anirban Acharya, professor of practice in the Department of Political Science at Lemoyne College, Nina Moore, professor and chair of the Political Science Department at Colgate University, Chad Sparber, professor and chair of the International Relations Department at Colgate University, and Ben Baughman, director of and an assistant professor in the Criminal Justice and Homeland Security program at Cazenovia College. You can watch the Ivory Tower weekly on WCNY at 8 p.m. on Fridays. We're delighted that David and several members of the panel have agreed to give some of their time to inform our audience and answer questions via the chat function. And now I'll get out of the way and cede the screen to David and the panel.
Okie doke. Well, thank you, Bill, and thanks for having us again. This is, I believe, the fifth time that I've done the spoken to Manlius Informed, because I've been hosting the program for 5 years now, which seems actually impossible to me to believe. But of course, we all know as we get older, our conception of time changes. And my little joke is I thought that I had outlasted Donald Trump, but maybe not, because he may be on his way back, which will certainly give people something to talk about. When Bill had asked me about doing the show again this year, or doing this event this year, I think we've got somebody's. There we go. Okay.
Yeah, there was an echo. Sorry. I really wasn't sure that the election would be all that interesting. We always do these after election day, and I wasn't sure that it would give us that much fodder to chew on here and to discuss. But I think that I was probably mistaken in that, judging by the conversations we had earlier this week, the conversations we've had on the program. So. I think what I would like to do here, I guess we'll take questions via the chat, and I'll keep an eye on that. And if you have a question in there, I'll try and direct it to whomever you'd like it to, or figure out who it ought to go to. But I think what I will do is turn it over to the panelists to give a little brief synopsis on their thoughts about really anything they want to think about or want to discuss, but obviously we're really sort of focusing on our political situation. So I'll begin with Nina, since Nina, you are, I think, the longest standing member here on our panel, by far, actually, as I look at it. We've got Nina and a few relative newcomers to the program. So
yeah, by a whopping 3 years.
Yeah, you're the veteran.
Yeah, I'm the veteran, so I'll take that and run with it. And I'm just going to offer some thoughts that are not necessarily tied to one another, but that I hope will sort of serve as the basis for the Q&A in our discussion, and perhaps also some of the reactions of my colleagues. I'm going to just sort of throw out some results from a Harvard-Harris poll that, to my mind, sort of showed that there was a disconnect between how Democrats ran, especially the Virginia race, but some other ballot issues. And so here are some of the results. First, they show that only 35% of registered voters approve of the Biden administration's immigration policy, but then fully 64% oppose of eliminating cash bail. Then nearly 90% of voters make clear that a key concern for them was inflation, and not just that problem is there, but 61% blame the Biden administration for the increase in gasoline prices. So again, the bottom line there is to just sort of show you can't really argue with the numbers, especially numbers out of Harvard that show that Democrats' priorities did not line up, nor did their messaging line up neatly with where voters were and arguably still are. Now, I want to quickly say that I don't think the goal of Democrats going forward should be to change the minds of Republicans or conservatives. That could be a lost cause because, at both ends of the spectrum, folks are really dug in to where they are in various positions. But I do think it's worth considering the possibility of winning over the 20% of Americans who not only self-identify as independent, but who have also demonstrated through their voting behavior that they are winnable. And certainly there has to be more of a focus on the suburban vote. I'm not going to say the rural vote because of the intersection with partisanship there, but the rural vote and the suburban vote are votes that Democrats may not want to concede in future elections. So that's kind of the first point, thinking about how to more closely align the Democratic messaging and agenda and priorities with those of voters, and basically talking to voters where they live. The second thing I'd say is that the culture wars, which have consumed so much of what's happening in national American politics, may help both the Democratic Party as well as the Republican Party in terms of energizing their base, mobilizing them, getting them to turn out. But that's not something that's necessarily going to win over new voters, right? You're not going to expand your base through these culture wars. And what we could see, even just focusing on the Democratic side, is that the candidate, now mayor-elect in New York City, Eric Adams, we're focusing on the fact that he won the general election, but I think we also have to pay attention to the fact that he won the Democratic primary in a relatively crowded field with an opponent in the person of Maya Wiley, who had tremendous name recognition at that point as the sort of progressive darling who had just enormous media coverage. Yet he beat her out. He beat her out as the moderate who focused on kitchen table issues. If we pan out also to look at Minnesota, Minneapolis in particular, which is a very Democratic terrain, and sort of the center point of so much of the protests that unfolded in the wake of the George Floyd killing, as well as a few others, we see there that mostly Democratic city of voters rejected defund the police. And in Virginia, we saw that Democrats focusing so much on abortion rights, and I don't want to necessarily fold that in with culture wars, but I think in some ways it can be. We saw there that it's not just that the abortion rights priority didn't jive with Virginia voters, but specifically with a majority of white women voters, right? And so if abortion rights is a women's rights issue, then certainly it should appeal to white women voters as well. So I just have a couple of other things that I'm going to mention, just sort of dovetailing on what I just said about the culture war, is that Democrats don't have to go to every fight that they're invited to, right? So in regard to the critical race theory that suddenly became a huge issue in Virginia and is continuing to sort of percolate to the top of agendas in other areas, there I think it would have been prudent for Terry McAuliffe to try as best he can to do something none of the rest of us have really been able to do, and that is to define what critical race theory actually is, and then quickly move on, rather than try to defend its placement and the curriculum, because that's really that's wasted time and energy. To return to an earlier point that I made, I think it is so important now to think about kitchen table issues with the rise in inflation, with the crunch on the supply chain, with the fact that the holidays are coming. and a number of other things, the sort of regrouping from the pandemic that doesn't seem to be happening as well as it should. All of those things should be takeaways for Democrats to think about how to avoid the repeat of the most recent elections. And so I have one other comment about the filibuster, packing the court, and so forth, but I want to stop there so my colleagues can jump in.
Oh, okay, thanks, Nina. And I'm sure the filibuster and packing the court will come up. So we'll get a chance to you'll get a chance to take a whack at those. Let's go to Anirban. You're a newcomer on the panel, and maybe people are not as familiar with you. And let's give them tell them a little about what you think about the recent events.
Well, I agree with Nina that there are, whenever voters kind of vote in political science as we study, there are these pocketbook issues about inflation and so on. And there are also these larger, what we call the sociotropic issues, where it doesn't really affect you directly, but there are these larger cultural issues that you kind of identify with. And I think both came into play in this election. But unlike the, mainstream commentariat, which is trying to kind of push this idea that this is too far left, the Democrats have moved too far left and that is hurting them, the data really doesn't pan out, right? As we can see, the verdict on, for example, a sociotropic issue could be police reform. And the verdict on police reform was very, very different, right? Yes, we have been concentrating on the Minneapolis, but again, in the Minneapolis Council, two very progressive candidates were elected, right? In Austin, for example, the city largely rejected a proposition that would have turbocharged the police force, right? In Seattle and many other places, there were wins. Larry Krasner in Philadelphia comes into mind. Alvin Braggs, the Manhattan DA, has moved on progressive reforms. So again, the verdict in that sense is kind of fractured. I will try to keep this short so that I can give other people more time. But I do think that voters, Democratic Party should concentrate on kitchen table pocketbook issues about about rising prices, lack of rising homelessness, and so on and so forth. And that would help the Democratic Party, right? So out of the total number of candidates that ran on explicitly progressive platform, 68% won, right? Across different tickets. My judgment would be that this is basically what we saw, if I have to sum up, is basically a post-election backlash against the Democratic Party that has been catalyzed by the kind of stalling of important legislations that could have helped the Democratic Party. But then, we are getting held hostage by the people of the Democratic Party themselves. So it's a very complicated situation.
Okay, so Anirban's comments there about the kitchen table issues and the rising prices seems to be the perfect segue to the economist on the panel. So let's go to Chad, who I suspect may have a little different take. And I'll tell the audience that after Chad's first time he was on Ivory Tower, we went out to breakfast and he was talking, and this was months ago, about inflation and the threat of inflation. And at the time, we weren't so sure what inflation might look like. Well, we have we've had some clarification on that. So with that, I'll turn it over to Chad.
So I had to laugh at Anirban's response because he actually used the line that I would expect a lefty to use, and that's I think the glass. I think the most glass half full look at the Democrats' performance in this last election is that the ruling party tends to do badly in midterms and so forth. But I think you got to be an awfully optimistic person from the left to read this election in that way. I think that when you look at numbers like Biden's polling numbers, They're bad, not just as the ruling party, but compared to previous administrations. Unlike Trump, his base is kind of meh. Biden is who he is. They don't get really excited about him, and I do think that in terms of the election results, the two most interesting takeaways for me are to look at Buffalo's mayor race and how the socialist won the primary, and the general electorate said no. And in Virginia, watching the the governor or the Republican candidate win without strong Trump backing. Like there's now a path forward, I think, for Republicans to win without being Trumpy, super Trumpy. But to address David's question, The Economist has this week's Economist, fantastic issue in lots of great articles in a lot of different ways, and they talk about Biden's problems, or the Democrats' problems, are COVID, inflation, and unemployment. And of course, those three things are all incredibly related. I think the inflation rates came out yesterday, and it's something like 6.2%. And I think even if you strip food and energy prices out of that, it's still at 4.5%. The Federal Reserve is now finally saying that, okay, maybe this isn't purely transitory, that this inflation is here and it's staying. And so we're going to have to do things like raise interest rates, which will cool the economy down a little bit more. And so, what are the solutions to that? Well, so much of the problems that we're having, I think, are these supply chain bottlenecks that people talk about. I mean, you see the port, like in Los Angeles, Long Beach, with lots of ships out there at sea with goods and stuff just hanging out there. So how do we get those into the U.S.? And that's what Biden's trying to attack now, right? Biden gave a speech a day or two ago about how concerned he is about inflation, and one of his policies is going to be to try to build that infrastructure first, right? The port infrastructure, but that's years in the making, improving that infrastructure. So that's not going to be a quick fix. And so, I think the Democrats' problems are huge. It's as I said, COVID, inflation, unemployment, but also a lot of people in the center who are thinking these super progressive socialist candidates are not for me.
Okay, thanks. I want to at some point get to this word socialism, because that always raises questions with me. What is socialism in the American context, right? Because, we'll get there. But first, I want to get Ben in and hear from him. And Ben, I think from our conversations that what strikes you is less the kitchen table issues as some other foreign policy mishaps, I guess you might say. So anyway, let's. What are your thoughts as we digest the news of the last few weeks?
I would probably rephrase that to some foreign policy train wrecks. In particular, how Afghanistan was handled, and I understand, and yet that a lot of people wanted to leave Afghanistan, but what wasn't taken into account was how it was done, how haphazard it was done, how throughout the development of withdrawal, there were a lot of red flags that were making it into public forums. So if we're hearing about it, I certainly hope that our intelligence are getting the information before the public is, and they continued down the path of this, for lack of a better term, train wreck, which did involve a drone strike on 10 innocent Afghans that were in the city. That is indicative of the lack of human information and intelligence that we were starting to see as we were pulling out. And the problem with Afghanistan is, without the human intelligence on the ground, no matter how sophisticated our drones are, which they are extremely sophisticated and accurate and can gather a lot of information, but due to the terrain of Afghanistan and the lack of human intelligence that we now have there, that is a huge problem. And I think that's something that people saw as well. It may not have come across in the poll numbers as far as what they said was important to them, but it was handled consistently for several weeks badly, topping off with a drone strike of a family instead of what they thought it was going to be, and losing soldiers on the ground, which brings me to, this is Veterans Day. Originally from 1918, the 11th hour, the 11th day, the 11th month. And we've got to be aware of how many veterans that we have in the United States and what they've done for us to keep our land secure. So I think the Afghanistan issue was in the forefront in part of the decision of who to vote for, even though we're not at a presidential election year. I do believe inflation played a part. I think also COVID. The Biden administration came in extremely confident with comments about how they were going to handle COVID and how they were going to take control of it because it had been mishandled under the Trump administration. And that's, what they were presenting. And we're still finding ourselves with COVID in our face. We're still finding ourselves with our own kids at home, at times having to go remote. So I think that there has been some, obvious hits on the poll numbers because of those reasons. The last thing that I want to hit on is this police reform. I have to mention that Austin, to go back to one of the comments that was made, that budget was cut by a third, which resulted in 150 officers being taken off the street, positions being removed. $150 million in 1 year of the budget being removed has resulted in a rise above the national average of murders across the United States, which defund the police has played a part in that, and a 30% decrease in response time in Austin, Texas. So although they may have voted to not do some referendums to getting some additional funding back into the police this round, they're going to continue to see the murders climb as they are, and the gun control and the gun crimes in Austin, Texas continue not to be addressed when you're not putting police officers on the street. They even canceled 3 academies in a row. So it's going to take time to fill those positions that are not there. You can't teach experience, and it takes experience, training, and knowledge to be effective in police work.
And we should tell the audience, if they don't know, that Ben spent 15 years in various roles as a police officer in Raleigh, North Carolina. Let's make sure we mute, because I'm hearing a lot of feedback coming through, and I'm sure you are too. I'm not sure where that's coming from. So Ben, there were a lot of things you mentioned there, and boy, I'd like to. There's a whole lot of things to pick up on here, but I want to ask you one question, and this isn't so much the election, but you've talked about Afghanistan and the lack of human intelligence, and that led into the drone strike, which went wrong. Well, first of all, do you think Americans they're going to vote because of that? A drone strike went wrong. Unfortunately, there have been thousands of casualties from drone strikes, civilian casualties over the time there in Afghanistan and also Iraq. But if you're going to have human intelligence there, are you advocating that we should not have left? Do you think that that's what Americans want? And my understanding is the polling shows the opposite.
Yes, the polling did show the opposite. What I am saying is, because we still have troops in the Middle East, and we do have a global presence throughout the world, that in order to be effective with that global presence, and in order to protect our soldiers that are left in the Middle East, including dozens of families that are left in Afghanistan by the Biden administration, reportedly, that are still there, along with this drone strike, I think just highlights some of the issues and concerns that are there. In fact, the families are reportedly saying in multiple media sites that they have not even heard from Washington, the families of the loved ones that were killed by the drone strike. So the drone strike alone, no, I don't think that would have impacted many votes, but I think it does contribute and does compound the efforts to leave Afghanistan. And I do agree. I think most people want us to pull out of these places where we've had these long-standing presence. But if we're going to continue to have presence in that region, now we can't fly over Afghanistan. So it does impact our ability to support soldiers and troops that we have in other countries in that area.
Okay. Well, if people have questions, you can put them into the chat, and I think we can, that's probably the easiest way to do this, and I'll keep an eye on that chat, or Bill, you can let me know if there's anything there. But I said before, I want to ask what socialism is, because this is the word of the day, right? I mean, every Republican's talking about those socialist Democrats, and this plan is socialism. And sometimes it becomes communism. They'll slip that word in there, and I don't see it. I don't understand why what we're doing in America, or what the Democratic Party is doing, is socialism, because Bernie Sanders calls himself a democratic socialist, and so does AOC, and now a few others. That's a far cry from sort of control the means of production socialism, which is what I always thought from my days in college studying this stuff, socialism was. So I know it's a word that gets a lot of attention, and it's provocative, but is this socialism?
I mean, in the early days of capital, if you look at the FDR era and the New Deal, I mean, that seems to be a very socialist and progressive policy. I mean, otherwise we would have chained children to machines, and we have worked 16-hour days and Saturdays and Sundays, right? So to my understanding, this is nothing about abolishing private property or taking control of the means of production. It's something that the right wing tries to kind of peddle into people's minds, but they are squarely failing at it, given what we are seeing in terms of various kinds of election results. Just to mention that, Phil Murphy won quite a progressive platform, and we concentrate on the Clintonite centrist who supported the TPP in Virginia. So basically the idea is that how much of the surplus that is generated by productive activity can go back to the working class. Why cannot United States have paid holidays, have like all other capitalist countries in the world? I would hardly imagine Denmark or Sweden or Norway or Germany to be communists, for God's sake, right? So, it makes for good news. It makes for, I get good issues for, people who are already kind of primed through American propaganda to hate anything in the left because, we are capitalists. But there are varieties of capitalism, and social democracy is a type of capitalism, right? And it concentrates on workplace dignity, and basically what Bernie Sanders and the group, if you will, is asking for are similar policies that have been there for a very long time in very vibrant democracies around the world, right?
Yeah.
Even in poorer democracies. So.
Yeah, but I don't necessarily disagree with you, Anirban, in terms of the similarities that you just pointed out. I would say, however, that part of the alarm in some corners around the push by Bernie Sanders implicitly by Elizabeth Warren, AOC, and some of the others is the framing of it. The framing of it entails a sort of paradigm shift from what we traditionally consider the American way, not simply of allowing the market to sort of, decide how benefits, goods are allocated, who wins, who loses, but rather the extent to which the government is responsible. Even if we look at the FDR years, which of course entailed a huge expansion of the role of government, that was seen as being limited in some places in terms of time, right? But then in other ways to look at specific parts of the economy that were not working for the less well-to-do. I think that with Bernie Sanders and with Elizabeth Warren, we're talking about a fundamental sort of reformulation of how much the government should play a role, if it should be primary or secondary. And I think secondly, there is an element of demonization in today's brand of socialism in America that may not be replicated elsewhere, in the sense that both with the two candidates that I mentioned in 2016 and 2020, also even to now in connection with the discussion over the social infrastructure bill, as it's called, to tax billionaires. And so I think connected to that is a sort of, quiet underground class warfare mentality that I think, again, is not appropriately, attributed to the FDR years, perhaps in other countries as well. So, and then I'll say finally that, at least to my mind, implicit in these modern versions of socialism is what many see as a fundamentally un-American idea, namely that government is about ensuring equal outcomes, equal results, more so than equal opportunity. So I think although there may be some similarities in the policies that you talked about in different areas, I do think that the principles, the theoretical, intellectual, ideological framing is really quite different and quite a departure from what we normally embrace in the US.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, David, I think the most direct answer to your question about what does socialism mean, I think that word is defined differently across different generations. To folks, including myself, who have a memory of the Cold War era, it means something like you first said, state ownership over the means of production, and a heavy hand in allocation of resources and stuff. And so that gets people like me just really tense. I think when millennials and younger folks, including the students that I teach, I think when they use the word socialism, what they're really complaining about is sustained rise in income inequality in the US and wealth inequality. Rising debt burdens on young folks through student loans and so forth. Increased housing costs for young people. You got people, including Bernie Sanders, who owns like 3 homes, whereas a young person can't afford one. And also like sympathy to millennials. They entered the workforce at the worst time in modern American history, right? They've seen incredibly slow aggregate macroeconomic growth. And so all of those opportunities that people in my generation and older had, they didn't. And so they're sort of resentful of a capitalist structure that rewards winners and not losers, because they lost by nature of the timing of their birth, right? And so then what gets really concerning to me about that is when they start to articulate their concerns, there is an anti-capitalist sentiment in some of what they say. And you can see evidence for that when, the Biden proposals or the policy right now is about taxing investment and taxing wealth in ways that will deter investment in the long term, right? That's something that The Economist, for example, recoils at. As Nina said, it's about emphasizing equal results as opposed to equality of opportunity. That's a concern. There's calls for anti-competitive behavior. There's calls for critical race theory, this phrase that keeps coming up. There are people who think that capitalism is an inherently racist institution that rewards white men over others. And so that kind of rhetoric by the people who would call themselves socialists now is, I think, what rightfully alarms people who are centrist or right of center.
The last thing that I'll add, and it's in line with what everybody's already said, is what I think voters are at least considering is how these proposals are going to be paid for. And they're not proposals such as a bailout. They are sustained, what people at least perceive as socialistic type of ideas. And what I mean by that is it's going to be over a long period of time and not just, hey, we're in a pandemic and we rightfully all need some assistance with how disruptive it's been. We're looking at changing directions and how the government here in the United States has operated, and having things in place that are like socialism in other countries as well.
Yeah, if I could, without necessarily disagreeing with myself and all that has been said mostly by Chad and Ben, I want to link with some of the sort of the gist of what Anirban was pointing out. And that is also connected with the social policy recommendations of the self-described socialists, are things that I think few of us would disagree with, right? So the fact that universal health care is a good thing, that in one of the richest countries, that America is one of the richest countries, we shouldn't have people, living in ways that all of their savings are wiped out because they have a health catastrophe. Secondly, in the US, only 1 out of 4 persons is able to attain a 4 college degree. And we know the long-term payoff for that. And also in thinking about our taxing system, our tax policies are such that billionaires pay a significantly smaller percent of their income, and a big part of their wealth is not subject to taxes at all. And when you have, a good dozen or so billionaires who are saying, yeah, we're getting over, and a president who bragged about being able to do so, then that's something to worry about. It was Warren Buffett who said that his secretary pays a larger percent, something like 27% of her income, whereas he pays in the single digits. So those are not exclusively socialist policies, but they certainly were championed by them to a greater extent than more centrist Democrats.
Okay, thanks. If people want to write in questions, I mean, we can talk amongst ourselves all day here, but if you have some specific questions for us, please put them in the chat, and we'll definitely get to them. I want to go back. Nina, you said in your opening remarks, you were saying about, from quoting this Harris poll, and said that 90% of respondents said that they were concerned about inflation, and that seems reasonable given the numbers that we've seen. And they blame the president for gas prices. So, I mean, that's such a, the easy way to think about inflation, because everybody knows what the price at the pump is, right? You might not know what a gallon of milk is, but you know the price of a gallon of gas. But I mean, what can the president do about that?
Well, I'm not really sure that I know the answer to that. I can theorize that some of those who are not satisfied with the president's approach don't necessarily warm up to his prioritization. And you're not going to like what I'm getting ready to say, Dave, but his prioritizing climate policies over the here and now. So the objection to drilling and using American, oil and gas resources at a moment of real pain at the pump is certainly a sense, or gives this sense, not so much that he can solve it, but rather some things that he can do. He's refusing to do, and sort of embedded in that is what the president is considering to be more important. Most prefer to maintain some form of energy independence, but we're at a time where there has to be exceptions because of all of the other things that are converging on ordinary people in the middle of a pandemic, right? Rising prices across the board on literally, I've been saying bread and butter issues, but literally on, bread and butter and bacon and milk and cheese and the worker shortage, the inability to turn to schools as a way to sort of, go to work. I don't want to call schools daycares, but for some people, it does allow them to work. All of these other things are figuring into the equation, and Biden taking the position that I really want to focus on climate change rather than do whatever small amount I can to at least give the appearance that, as Bill Clinton would say, I feel your pain. In this case, your pain at the pump.
So maybe what he ought to do, you're suggesting to improve that perception is say we'll open up some drilling, because if you say we're going to have drilling, it's not going to make any immediate impact, or even like the Keystone pipeline, right? I mean, even if he hadn't canceled that project, would any oil be coming through that yet? I can't imagine it would.
Yeah, no, because
it's not overnight, but maybe.
Yeah, it's not just the natural resources. Of course, we know that the delivery is where America falls short. And to answer your question very directly, no, it's not. But it is a matter of making clear to that 61% of voters who are blaming him that I'm doing something. And this connects with a comment that Ben was sort of offering to us earlier, that there isn't as much accountability and sort of accepting that the buck stops with the president on a number of these issues, not just in regard to Afghanistan, but a president who is more inclined to say, I get it, I know this is an issue, I'm working on it. I think would lower that percent of folks who are dissatisfied with his performance and are blaming him.
Mm-hmm. Maybe he needs.
I just want to put on record, though, that yes, I think the messaging is wrong, but AP is reporting that approvals for companies to drill or oil and gas on U.S. public lands are on pace this year to reach the highest level since George W. Bush's presidency. So while Biden is saying all this stuff, there is a record number of approvals of drilling for oil and gas in natural lands. So I'm just wanting to put it out there.
Was that done before gas went up to $4 in some places?
This is AP was reporting this since July, and then later on the Audubon Society picked it up about the general trend. But I do agree with you. There is a messaging issue here, Nina. As political scientists, we will understand that, right? Like in what way voters are particularly perceiving it. And I'm not sure how much people in US are willing to compromise on their very luxurious lifestyles for the benefit of the poor in other countries. And this brings me to the drone point, because America has been droning children and people for a long time. In fact, Obama administration raised the droning strikes at a much higher level than the Bush administration and got elected. So I don't think this is an old thesis we have in American politics, that America has two presidencies. One is the presidency for the domestic, one is the presidency for the foreign, and the foreign presidency doesn't really impact that much in domestic results other than massive catastrophic failures, for example, Iraq war and so on and so forth. So yeah, I mean, Obama administration had been using drones, and there are good websites that if you write to me or people write to me, I will send out about the number of drones that have killed innocent children and people for quite a long time.
Yeah,
Okay,
I would point out the compounding effect, though, that those websites may not properly highlight.
Let me throw out to the audience here that if you prefer to ask a question in person and you're not necessarily comfortable doing it in the chat, that's fine. We just want to hear from you. So if you'd like to say something You can either do if you know how to use the raise hand function, you can do that and we'll spot it. But if not, just chime in. You can raise your hand in person, as Ben just did. So we can do that. Now, Bill has asked a question in the chat about redistricting and the current redistricting efforts in New York State. And of course, that was also part of the recent ballot initiative on, initiative number 1, which went down to ignominious defeat. What do we think is going to happen with redistricting? And we'll just open it up for comments on that. Any one of you guys.
So I think that first proposal, there were a lot of things clubbed together into it, but what it kind of tantamounted to is that the political parties would have more power in changing the redistricting of the bipartisan panel. And I think voters rejected that. They didn't want more power for political parties. So I think this is a good result from the New York State to have that kind of idea that no party should be able to control redistricting, and there should be more bipartisan effort. So I think that's why it got rejected.
Mm-hmm. I wonder too. We're right. That's a good point. That all you needed was a majority, a single person majority, and you could have, for instance, if Democrats who now are in control could have kept Republicans from weighing in on the or forcing a new district, writing their own plan. Even though we have a commission in New York State, the commission has not been working very well thus far, though, right, Nina? I mean,
well, I mean, from its very inception, it was designed to not work so well because it effectively was put in place so that they'd have the right to come up with a map. But then if the legislature chose to just discard the map, then it could do so. So to my mind, that wasn't real reform, except insofar you put in place the infrastructure, but without allocating the powers properly, which brings us to, I think, one of the points I was hearing in Anirban's comments, and that is, you don't have sufficient incentive on either side of the aisle to substantially rework how redistricting is done in New York, because both parties benefit to the extent that, Democrats always manage to have a good number, more recently, a solid majority of seats, and Republicans have a much larger percent of seats than they would ordinarily have in a state in which you have Democrat voters outnumber Republican voters by 3-1. So I don't see how there's really a reason for either to change. If it ain't broke from the perspective of legislators, why change it? And I think, as we can think about this in two ways. There is the redistricting of the state legislature, other state offices. And then there is the redistricting of congressional offices that New York Democrats seem to have less interest in. You'll recall the last time we came up against redistricting, both parties, the legislature decided, when it comes to congressional redistricting, we'll just leave it to the federal judge. And so she had to develop, a plan working with court-appointed magistrates to do the job that we elect state legislatures to do.
I have to admit that when a topic becomes more local, my opinions become less valid. And I'm an international economist and I teach international classes. I don't know about local stuff, but I'll give you my opinion anyway. So my thought coming into New York was actually that our districts were something that New York actually did something well compared to other states, but maybe I'm wrong on that. The concern that I have recently is the talk about the attempts to district Catco out of office. That really concerns me. I like Catco a lot. And I think the role he plays in as a centrist Republican who's willing to cross party lines is a really, really important one. And this last election result, one of the interesting takeaways I have of this and kind of frightened ways, I think with the elections that just happened, the Republicans are seeing the Democrats up against the ropes. And as a result of that, the Republicans are more adamant about don't compromise anymore. And so you see them kind of attacking the centrist Republicans who crossed party lines in the House to vote for Biden's hard infrastructure package, and Catco was one of them. And there are 13 Republicans who did that in the House. There were 19 in the Senate. The senators didn't get that pushback, but the congressmen are. And so I'm worried both in a national and in a local sense that people like Catco aren't getting the love they deserve and they're not getting the support they deserve. And so, yeah, I'm worried about how redistricting is going to affect him.
I think that's a real issue. You may be an international economist, but for your local opinion seems quite valid to me. And I wonder, redistricting, is that Catco that they're going to try and redistrict out of office, as you put it, or his partner over in the 22nd district where I vote, Claudia Tenney? Because it seems to me that they'd probably prefer to redistrict her out of office rather than him, because he is someone who will cross party lines, and she defines herself as Trump before Trump.
So if Catco and Tenney were pitted against each other in a Republican primary in this area broadly, who would win? I don't know. That's an honest question. Who would you?
Well, that would really.
That's a hard question. Like, that's a hard answer. I mean, 538 would call it a very close race.
Yeah, that is actually a pretty interesting question. I guess we can probably be assured they won't be able to redistrict Lisa Stefanik out of office, right? So she will still be there. But Tenney barely won her election, and it was that was the election where there was a great deal of confusion, shall we say, in some of the voting offices, boards of elections, especially in Oneida County, and 2,000, I think it was over 2,000 applications for voter registrations were never actually processed in Oneida County. So who knows how that, and she's from Oneida County, of course, how that might have turned out. We do have a question here in the panel, thank you, about climate change and excuse me, I'm just reading it here. What does the panelists think needs to be done about addressing the urgent need to address climate change before warming spirals out of control? And also the sort of the upward shift in wealth. That's the income inequality that was mentioned earlier. So let's throw it out there about climate. I mean, we have they're meeting right now in Scotland. They've been meeting for a week or more. And there has been some positive news coming out of that, but there's also been some real negative that if we're undercounting emissions, that maybe we're looking at 2.5 degrees, which would be really
there are a couple of very good things that in the infrastructure bill that passed. So, for example, there is a real need for upgrading the electrical grid. It's just not, and again, I was very interested in watching the John Oliver's Last Week Tonight episode. So as an academic, I'm giving my references out there. It is important that, we just, plug in more cars. Yeah, we can decarbonize, but where our electrical grids are not capable of taking that power, and economically speaking, the best thing would be to upgrade that, upgrade the distribution framework. And, study after study, I come from the tradition of political economy. It has been shown that public and reliable, good public transport has a huge impact on both employment and reduction in emissions. And a large part of the world, depends on public transport. I was, in fact, when I first came here fresh off the jumbo jet in 2004, I was kind of surprised that everybody is driving in one car and going, it was a very strange thing to see. But now I'm used to it. I do the exact same thing, right? So, my answer would be very simple: public transport, and we are already doing something good, which is upgradation of our electrical grids. And regarding, regarding upward distribution of wealth, well, vote progressives. There's something that's going right.
Right. That's what Joe Manchin said, right? He said to the progressive wing of the party, if you want to have these policies, elect more liberals.
I have a better solution.
I'm sorry, Nina, go ahead.
No, it's okay. So I agree with Anirban that public transportation, that's a given, but one of the things that has to be done is public transportation, viable public transportation options have to be expanded to areas where you don't now have that, right? And some inner city areas where it's viable, right? For example, here in Syracuse, to get from one end to the other end of a very small city, you often have to spend 2 hours sitting at the hub, right? And so that's an issue. And then certainly for rural America and even some suburban areas, just because we don't have the kind of metropolitan planning that some other countries have, it's a matter of getting that public transportation out there. But, Chad, I hear you. The answer isn't to elect more progressives. I'm not going to agree or disagree on that. I will say this: whomever needs to be in office, you got to first convince the electorate to elect those folks. And I think that's a two-part issue that segues to the other part of Scott's really excellent question. The first is, I think it is so important to make the case for climate change in ways that don't just persuade the educated and those who have sort of the freedom to think about the polar bears 30 years from now, but the folks who've got to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning, find public transportation to go in up to an hourly wage job and worry about, childcare and so forth. I think you've got to find a way to make clear to that large swath of the electorate that climate change affects them, not at a distant point in the future, but even currently. And to segue to the other part of Scott's question of how do you sort of shift our or change our limited attention to the concentration of wealth, one way, and I'm going to defer to the economists here, is to change how we talk about who's winning and losing. So often we look at the success of the stock market, we look at other indicators that are not tied to the folks who are less fortunate. And so changing what we call economic progress and changing what we call an adequate wage. It's not just about increasing the wages to whatever absolute level, but also looking seriously at whether or not that works. And so I think just talking about who's winning, who's losing, what constitutes winning and losing, and when is our economy in good shape? Is it in good shape because of what's happening on Wall Street, or is it in good shape because there's a greater spread of the benefits, a wider spread?
The part of Anirban's statement that I agree with is the electrical grid part. I mean, that is part of the infrastructure that we need to improve to make this happen, I guess. In terms of solutions to address Scott's issue, so I throw David for a curveball sometimes on this issue as a conservative Republican that's going to support a tax. And look, carbon emissions are bad, and I have no qualms taxing bad things to incentivize proper behavior. And so if you, even at a very simple level, something like a gasoline tax, which I am aware will raise the price of gasoline, I think is perfectly reasonable. Now, that kind of a tax will punish the poor more than it'll punish the wealthy, because poor people spend more of their time commuting, they have to live farther away from work, and that sort of thing. So then you could take those tax revenues and redistribute them to the poor in some way. And so, Scott, that's a way of, I guess, attacking both of your topics with one policy. Now, the funny thing is the attempts in America to do this sort of thing, to tax carbon, there have been ballot initiatives in Washington State, one of the most progressive states in the country, to do exactly this sort of thing, and they resoundingly fail. And so, I don't know why so-called progressive Seattle can't get behind this, but it would be a sensible solution, entirely consistent with neoclassical economic prescriptions to tax bads like carbon emissions and redistribute the income to the tax revenues to poor people. That'd be fine.
I will say that I cast one of my first presidential votes for John Anderson back in 1980, who advocated back then a very large increase in the gasoline tax. And that was before we even quite grasped how the situation with climate. What about cap and trade, Chad? Is that a viable way to attack this problem?
It'd be wonderful. Yeah. And the Europeans are talking about things in interesting ways about this topic. They're also talking about, a carbon import tax. So if they're importing goods that are produced abroad that have a lot more carbon emissions than their own policies would have, that they're gonna tax that as well. There's accounting challenges involved. How do you measure the actual carbon emissions that are coming out? What do you do about people who cheat and stuff like that? But broadly, the answer is cap and trade on carbon emissions is a perfect solution.
Of course, politically, a carbon tax has gone nowhere in the U.S., right? I mean, and it doesn't seem like it will go anywhere anytime soon. If Congress flips back in the next election next year.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, even if Congress doesn't flip back, what else is not going to go anywhere is getting rid of cows, right? Because of their greenhouse emissions and how much they contribute to methane. I'm not giving up my cheeseburger for the climate. Sorry.
Okay, you laid down a marker.
Yes, that's why I draw the line.
But there are. It strikes me that if the issue is so huge and so critically important, that if you take things in smaller components, and we often hear people say, well, so all of the above is the solution, and maybe it is all of the above. We're trying to decarbonize our energy. I think that we have to have a serious conversation about increasing nuclear power. And I know that gets some environmentalists quite upset. Others have come around to that position. But it seems to me that with its known problems, that's one thing that could be done. Conservation is overlooked. I mean, and it's been, we do a whole lot better now because our appliances are much more efficient than they used to be. So efficiency can be part of this solution too. Different land practices, different farming practices. All of those things, in addition to, the different, new approaches to the energy system. And as you point out, Ben and Chad both, that without a rebuilt electrical grid, we can all drive electrical cars, but we're not going to be able to get the energy. Maybe if we put a solar panel on our roofs of our garage, we can hook into it that way.
You know, just to add kind of to Nina's point. Okay, so why did the progressives bother me on this? Their gut reaction is to ban things, right? So California is going to ban internal combustion engines in new cars starting in, I don't know what it is, 2030. And there are other states that are doing the same thing. And those command and control policies where you ban things, like, for example, beef, if you were to ban beef, right? That's
Nobody's talking about banning beef, though.
Nobody's talking about it yet, but
AOC was pushing that.
And that's the problem. Just tax me for eating beef. I'm fine, but don't tell me not to eat it altogether.
No, and I think Ben's got his hand up too.
No, I think, I mean, this, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll be quick. One thing I think that we're focusing too much on is this taxing and not coming back to this. Not only is it a global issue on many levels, like we're talking about planet Earth, which isn't just in America. We've got to get everybody educated, including China, which is a significant producer of a lot of our global emissions of CO2. So, I mean, there's 5 countries that are responsible for about 60% of the CO2, and US being in second place. We're not in the lead in this one. China's beaten us, and they're beating not only us, but the other ones that are in the top 5, India, Russia, and Japan. So this is a global problem that needs a global response with education and sustainable energy that is not as detrimental to the globe.
Well, there's progress there because of the agreement now between the US and China. We'll see whether or not they put meat on the bones, but looks like we're moving in the right direction, at least with respect to the 2 largest guilty parties.
India should not be overlooked in this equation. Right, a huge country and growing and increasing, I think still increasing use of coal.
Well, they did put forward a very substantial goal, but they did not explain exactly how it was going to be done. So they put on at least a brave and confident face in the future of trying to limit CO2.
And I think we all have to accept that things have to change in some regard. And if you think back about, I guess it was 15 years ago or so. I remember I did this piece for NPR about the New York Regional Interconnect. So this was to bring power from the northern part of the state, or even hydropower from Quebec. Hydro-Quebec produces a tremendous amount of power, to bring it down to the downstate population centers. And the power lines were going to, would come right down through, I think it was Shenango County in particular. At least that's where I did the story. I remember it was like Sherburne or one of those towns I went to, and that didn't fly. I mean, it's a NIMBY issue, right? So we all have that, and I understand that, because I don't, I wouldn't want a power line next to my house either. But that's out there, and we all have to make these adjustments. I will say one thing: President George H.W. Bush, Herbert Walker Bush, who I generally liked, but he really annoyed me with one comment when he mocked Al Gore, and it must have been when they were running against Clinton Gore, saying this guy wants, he called him ozone man, remember? And he said, this guy wants to get rid of the internal combustion engine. And that's where this is going. That's where this has to go, it seems to me. I think we've known that for 30 years, Chad, and California is doing something about it. So, what's the solution? Well, one solution is not to drive internal combustion engines anymore. Although I admit I have a hybrid, so I'm still putting gas in my car, right? But my next car is going to be.
I agree with Chad on the fact that, banning something doesn't help. The war on drugs shows that. So I think taxation and, carbon permit trading is quite a good approach in creating the market for carbon. Although, I mean, there are a couple of new documentaries that are floating up showing the level of scamming of that the companies have done in terms of this TPP, but that's also part of any kind of public policy. I don't think banning works, but I also think socialists kind of take this kind of weird heat for actually not proposing any of that stuff. There are a lot of important economists on the progressive side across the Atlantic. And regarding pollutions, I just want to point out that we talk about global polluters, but let's do a favor and go check the per capita pollution emission by an average American and by an average Chinese or an Indian. And we will see it's massively large. So the Europeans and Americans, for example, the Western developed world, right, spend way more per capita in consumption of energy than anywhere in the other parts of the world. A 2000 report was in fact 9 times the rest of the world and 5 times that of Europe, right? So we talk about, big polluters, but at the same time, we don't talk about, massively amount of gas we spend in blowing leaves, cutting our lawns, massive lifestyle, huge houses. So that's something to think about, how, Americans can actually, or people in the Western world can think about their hugely wasteful lifestyle. About 50% of food in US gets wasted, right? So those are the things that, doesn't get talked about in the commentariat mainstream. And it's important to talk about those, the per capita emission.
Yeah, let me just quickly say that for China, they're leading us in the most pollution. The number one area is coal that they're burning, not the cars that they're driving, not the lawns that they're mowing. So just to point out that it's really the manufacturing of cars that create a lot more pollution than the cars themselves.
And those coal factories are related to the cheap products that we get all the time. Our average American home has 7 to 8 screens. How is that possible? It's because of cheap products made in China.
So that brings us back to trade policy.
Well, wait, David, I think the answer to your question is the problem isn't the internal combustion engine, so don't ban it. The problem is the CO2 emissions. That's what you want to tax. That's what you want to reduce. And so that's that you attack that narrow problem and not say, well, this solution is to ban internal combustion engines. Those kind of command and control policies are more costly and punitive solutions to a problem that relative to safety.
Well, let me counter that with a comment from our questioner.
No.
Okay, who has written in the chat, we banned lead in paint and gasoline and chlorofluorocarbons in refrigerators and air conditioners. And now we have unleaded gas, he says, and refrigerants less damaging to the ozone. So why would that not work to do that? To use the ban as a policy, just because you don't like it, because we want to do tax or ban the I guess tax in this case the emission.
It's a really interesting question, and I'd have to think about it a little bit more. I mean, everything I'm given right now is on the fly, right? So take that with a grain of salt. But my memory of CFCs were that they were produced by like one or few companies, like I think 3M or something like that, and that they were pretty viable and easily usable substitutes. And so that was kind of an easy problem to solve. I think that company was more or less fully on board with it and was transitioning anyway. And I think, again, the kind of answer more broadly in terms of these bans, I mean, perhaps one answer is that it would have been more, you could have accomplished the same goals more cost effectively by taxing as opposed to outright banning.
Okay.
I do want to qualify a little bit, and I agree with Chad. I think the main reason for some of the bans to be successful is because the enforcement works, and the enforcement is not that costly. And there is also broad-based support. So for example, a good thing, again, from the infrastructure bill is that we will not have any more lead pipes in US, right? So that is also, given the excellent question we had right now, right? That's also another good example that we will be able to ban certain things. And yes, I do agree in terms of political economy approach, taxing works in certain ways, but there are certain things that are extremely hazardous and have to be banned, right? So, you know, we always play that kind of cost benefit analysis. How much money would it take to enforce? Can we really enforce it? Or are there efficient ways that we can get the same outcome by taxing or giving incentives? You know.
So is our shared answer here, Anirban, that lead is super hazardous, so ban it, whereas the internal combustion engine not super hazardous, so go more?
No, I think it would be difficult to enforce. I mean, just California doing it would not matter, right? You have to do it nationwide. So as a political economy scholar, like you need to bring the power to make this policy, and that power would not exist in that sense. So, you know, at one point of time, we have to reckon with the fact that we all float on water. So how we get there is, you know.
Yeah, I definitely agree with your point that enforcement works. So we need to fund those who enforce things.
I agree.
Okay, especially if they wear Kevlar vests, right, Ben? Well, you know, it's interesting. We're having this discussion, and I'm realizing, well, Nina mentioned in the beginning those kitchen table issues, and I can't see even this discussion. We've gotten away from the kitchen table issues, and we're into more esoteric areas that maybe voters don't respond to. But I will say, and anybody who's watched me on the program, I guess, in over the 5 years I've been there, that this is something that we do return to again and again, because it's climate is, it seems to me climate's the whole enchilada, right? I mean, you know, I think it was John Glenn who spoke quite eloquently about when he first went up into space, one of the early astronauts, and could see the very thin, you know, the blue Earth and this incredibly thin atmosphere around it, and that atmosphere makes everything possible. And you know, he was saying we have to take care of it, and that was, I believe, before we even really started talking about climate. One other thing about climate, well, 2 points I want to make. One is just, I don't know if people generally realize that this has been, you know, we say, okay, if you were to say, when did the public first start thinking about climate change? And most people think about when James Hansen testified in Congress, and I think that was 1988, that really hot summer, and that we started to talk about this. But as far as I know, the first president to be briefed about climate was LBJ. So this goes back even further. So we've been doing nothing about this for 65 years now, or 55 years, I guess.
They worrying about global cooling then?
Now, you know, that global cooling thing, I almost just swore, I'm sorry. The global cooling thing is not true. That is, you know, there were a couple of papers that were produced, and okay, I'm in the media, and I understand a good story, and so someone put that on the cover of Time or Newsweek or whatever, but it was never a big deal, never. At the time, they were already worried about climate. I just saw a hand up somewhere. Well, it's gone back down again. And anyway, that got me all worked up, and I forgot the second point I was going to make. So I don't remember what it was. Nina's got her hand up. Okay, Nina.
No, I just thought I heard someone trying to get in there.
I'm sorry, who was?
I thought I heard someone trying to speak. I guess.
No, I was just letting Dave know that I was clapping. Those were clapping hands.
Oh, that wasn't raising. That was.
Yeah,
clapping.
sorry about that. Yeah, sorry.
All right. Well, all right. Any other questions from the audience out there? I'm really trying hard to think what was that second point I was going to make. I'm sure it was brilliant.
And I'm sure it was about climate change.
It was about climate change. Yes, it was about climate change. You know what I wanted to say earlier, Nina, when you were talking about, getting this across to the working person who gets up at 5 a.m. and takes the bus, and this impacts farmers probably, right now more than anybody, and our farms, and farmers obviously care about the land, and that may be the way to get at some of this to people who in areas of the country that maybe don't take it as seriously as I might like, to somehow enlist them in the discussion.
I really don't think it's a matter of everyone wanting the earth to survive. I really don't think that's it. I think, and I'm starting to sound like a broken record here. I think it's a matter of how different political and policy agendas are arranged and what is prioritized, and the extent to which there is an awareness, a sensitivity to a respect for the concerns of some voters. And I can tell you, that the folks that I grew up with and am still very much connected to, and I volunteer at a local soup line, that, this climate change discussion just does not resonate. And how to convey that to the more learned of us, the more educated, those who really do understand the long-term ramifications, is a difficult thing. So, Dave, just to bottom line this, I don't think that, other people don't get it, working class folks don't get it, but you get a very healthy dose of Fox News telling their very large audience that liberals don't get it and they don't care about them being able to take care of their immediate needs. And I'm reminded here, it's either a saying I got off of Facebook, or maybe it's a Bible verse that says that, let tomorrow worry about itself. Sufficient today is the evil thereof, or something along those lines. And so I think that, it's about, recognizing that sometimes this conversation about climate change, not in our circles, but in other circles, comes across as, I'm more worried about plants and pets and, polar bears than I am about childcare.
Right. Well, I certainly can understand that. And I think part of that may be that the discussion has to be that, climate change means that not necessarily simply global warming, but that the climate patterns change. And so areas that may be used to a certain weather, that's going to change and could change, and that has some drastic implications.
Yeah, and all the coal miners who would lose their job to you remember that whole kerfuffle, to say to them, yeah, you're going to lose your jobs, right? We were talking about thousands of coal miners during the election. But to say to them, here are cleaner jobs that don't carry with it the sort of health concerns, and that will pay as well, and that will be more stable, predictable on a seasonal basis than other types of jobs. I think, it's partly messaging, but it's also understanding people are differently situated around this issue, so that some people don't have the luxury, because it really is a luxury, don't you think, to worry about what's going to happen to the environment 30, 40, 50 years from now. I think that is a luxury. And
except that, and I realize we've gone way into this climate discussion, and there's other issues out there. I'll just say, yes, that's a luxury, but we were saying the same thing 30, 40, and 50 years ago. Now we're 30, 40, 50 years down the road. And we're
But
still
to-
saying, the same thing.
To Ben's point and Nina's point, I mean, that's a global issue, right? I mean, the US, isn't it nice to be wealthy and telling now emerging markets what to do with their energy policy? So there's a call in the Economist this week about, well, we ought to be sending money to Congo to preserve rainforest lands because we all benefit from that. Is that going to happen?
I doubt it.
Yes.
Now,
All great. Sorry, just real quick, Nina's point about finding the common ground, or at least that's how I took it, that we're all interested in saving the earth. It's really a matter of how do we get on the same page of doing that. And the best way to get people to do things is not forcing them to do things, but motivating and influencing them to do things incrementally, making changes. And that's really about education and showing that we're going in a direction that climate change is not a good thing.
okay, and that's, let's make that the final word on climate for now. And I don't know if anybody else has anything else you want us to touch on before we go on to our day jobs. I don't see anything in the chat. Anybody else have any questions? Bill, what about you? Do you have anything on your mind? This makes me sound like a therapist there.
Well, I really did. I was very curious about redistricting. So thank you all for answering that. I have a feeling I'm going to be getting a speaker for that for next spring's Manlius Forum series.
And when we did talk about redistricting, I do want to emphasize, I think the point Chad was making about John Katko, who's really put himself out on a limb here with his party, and seems to be voting his conscience, which would be nice if people did that from both sides, because instead of just stick to what the party says, because this is a really interesting situation where the Senate, this was a negotiated bill with the Senate, and now that they're the House is even, Republicans in the House are even turning against it. And that 13, and there's only some of them have already said they're not going to run again. And that's,
Right.
that's unfortunately for our political system.
Well, I think also, Tom Reed I think it's more likely that his district will get districted out. And then one of the things you have to consider is, where do you then sort of move the Katko voters? Because, Syracuse makes up like 135 out of the 650 or so. How do you shift those lines in a way that you avoid slicing into the power of the city of Syracuse and still maintain the Supreme Court's basic rules about, contiguity and population proportionality? I just, and then do you want to sort of strengthen the conservatism of the Republican New York coalition if you were to get rid of the moderate, that is to say, Katko? So I don't think it's going to be a very easy thing to do to eliminate Katko, and I think both parties are probably going to be more inclined to just slice and dice Tom Reed's district more than anything else.
Okay.
So I was hearing that Katko is going to get primaried. Is that from somebody who's a Marine? Is that something? Yep. Can anyone like Nina or Chad, David?
Yeah, that's the last I think I just read that this morning.
Somebody's already announced. Yes, somebody. I forgot who he is, but there's some Democrats who have already announced too that they want to take him on. But yes, somebody from Manlius, I believe. Bill, we're looking at you.
And it's a she, I think.
Well, I know there is a woman who's a former veteran who's gonna be in the Democratic primary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Bill, I think we've pretty much run out of time. So thanks very much. We enjoyed doing these, and I hope that it was interesting for the audience. And I'd like to thank everybody for watching Ivory Tower. I'm hoping that you do. And if you don't, we don't want to tell people what to do, right, Chad? So I'm not going to tell you to watch Ivory Tower. I'm going to suggest it. Friday night's date, as Bill said at the beginning, and thanks very much.